My name is Richard Green, and I'm director of the USC Lusk Center for Real Estate, which is one of the hosts of this conference, along with the USC Price School of Public Policy and the Terwilliger Center for Innovation and Shelter at Habitat for Humanity. Let me begin by thanking our sponsors, FivePoint, whose founding chairman, Emil Haddad, will be speaking to us later today. The Price School, as I mentioned, the Lusk Center, the Casden Real Estate Multifamily Forecast. And I'd also like to thank, we had an organizing committee that put this event together, and I'm sure to forget someone, but Monica Rashkin from Habitat, Patrick McAllister. Is Patrick here yet? Oh, there, see, masks make it. I'll put my mask back on as soon as I come down. Steve Malpezzi, Maria Hochschmidt. Is Maria in? Oh, there. Arthur Aguilin. Arthur? I know I saw him. Oh, you're sitting in all different parts of the room, so. And have I forgotten anybody on the organizing committee? I'm good at forgetting things. Okay, well, if I just offended you, you can let me know later today, because I missed you, but I think that's the group. And I think we put together a really kind of amazing lineup for this morning and the next morning, and I'm looking forward to learning from this remarkable group of people. And so with that, let me start by sort of setting the stage for what this conference is about. The other members of the committee assigned me this task, which is sort of an intimidating task because I look at this room, and among other things, I see a lot of past, current, and maybe future co-authors in the group who are really good at telling me when I get things wrong. So I'm sure to get some things wrong in the next 20 minutes or so. But this conference is about where does housing belong as we think about economic development, and in particular, raising living standards for places around the world. So here's it's housing and economic development, cause or effect. This sort of a theme when we think about economic development in a lot of contexts is what goes first, the development or the thing that either is caused by or causes development. I'm going to talk a little bit about that with the urbanization debate in a bit. But I'm going to start with a brief overview of the debate about housing's position as a tool of or beneficiary of economic development. I'm going to just show a slide or two about where we stand with respect to housing worldwide and ask what might we do? And just thinking about urban, rural, and I want to spend at least a minute or two talking about rural housing, because an awful lot of the time we spend when we talk about housing is urban. There's still a lot of places around the world that are not urbanized, and it is not entirely clear that urbanization per se is a driver of economic development. And so we need to think about, for people who live in rural areas, these billions of people who live in rural areas, how do we address their needs? Debate about should this be something the public sector does or the private sector does. I want to talk a little bit about owning and renting, and then in situ or not. And then I'm going to just do a brief comparison of two countries, one of which has invested a lot in housing early on in its period of economic development, and the other that really didn't invest in housing at all in its early period of economic development. They're both countries that have done remarkably well, which shows how hard it is to try to figure out what leads to what. Okay, so summary of the debate. There's a terrific paper by Arku in I always get this journal name wrong, but the Journal of the Built Environment in 2006 that summarizes the debate. And you know what we say, my friend Steve Malpezzi taught me a long time ago, when you steal from somebody else and don't cite it, that's plagiarism. When you steal from someone else and do cite it, that's scholarship. So what I'm going to do is steal from Arku a little bit today. But if you go back to sort of the development literature from the 40s and 50s, and even early 60s, there was a lot of stuff about housing was something that should not be paid attention to as you're thinking about countries moving forward. And what's really striking is even Paul Samuelson weighed in on this. Now, Paul Samuelson weighed in on pretty much everything involving economics, and he called housing a quote-unquote dead asset. Basically, if you took capital and you put it into housing, it was kind of useless capital, right? And this is a guy who wrote maybe the seminal text on mathematical economics in 1947 with his foundations. Again, made remarkable contributions throughout economics. And this is a guy who says, he wrote an essay called The Problem of Housing. And he basically said, 1955, and he said, don't do it. Don't do it until you're rich. Then you can house people. There were a whole lot of other people who went along, and these are quotes just pulled from ARCU. So Strassman in 1970, financing housing without raising productivity was throwing money into a bottomless pit. Charles Kindleberger, again, another renowned economist, questioned the desirability of investing in housing where resources were scarce. Housing investment was regarded as a classic means of slowing economic growth, Gilbert and Gugler, or loses out to investment in industry or industrial infrastructure. So this was, I would say, until the early 80s, and I'm going to come to that in a second, there was sort of a consensus in the field of economics that housing was a social thing and not an economic thing. And so if you want a country to grow, it's not something that you should be focused on. Okay, well, I think there's been some really important thinking that has led to some reconsideration, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But I think those attitudes from the 50s and 60s and even 70s still is with many people in the world of economic development in terms of thinking about economic development moving forward. But one of the most important books I've read in my life was a book I was assigned my first year as a graduate student, which is Deaton and Muehlbauer's Economics and Consumer Behavior, which I still, my dog-eared copy is something I refer to frequently. And what Deaton and Muehlbauer did is present a formal model of what they called a household production function. So the idea is it's not just factories that make stuff. Households also make stuff, some of which is not measured in GDP, and this sort of gets at the Stiglitz point about GDP not doing a great job of measuring everything. So you think about people who cook for themselves, that's productive activity. Doesn't necessarily show up in GDP. It probably doesn't show up in GDP, but it's productive activity. But there's other stuff that goes on too. So the way we can think about it is a house by itself is a factory. Lots of productive stuff can happen in its presence that can't in its absence. And I'm giving here the first sort of small business in poor countries I learned about when I started doing some work with the World Bank was the auto rickshaw, the tuk-tuk. And very often, the auto rickshaw, it's a business. And the driver of the auto rickshaw and the owner of the rickshaw is also the mechanic of the auto rickshaw. And where do they keep it fixed and running? At their home garage. So if they don't have a place, if they don't have secure tenure, and they don't have at least a minimum amount of infrastructure going to that place, it's very hard for them to run this small business. And I learned about this business actually in the context of what was then sort of the new Mohammed Yunus micro-lending, which was how lenders would underwrite tuk-tuk drivers as they would go out and look at their shed to see, okay, are they maintaining this thing or are they not? And if they are, then yeah, let's give them a loan so that they can get maybe a better engine or something like that. But if they're not, we're not going to make them the loan. So this sort of having this place was key, among other things, to making capital, albeit small, available to people who otherwise wouldn't have it. And driving people around is obviously a productive activity. There are other things, too, with housing, human capital and health. The picture on the left is a very famous picture from a TED Talk that Paul Romer gave about charter cities. Now, you could say what you like about whether charter cities are a good idea or not. That's for another conference. But the picture was always striking to me. This is a picture taken, if I recall correctly, from Dakar, Senegal. And it's a picture of kids studying under lampposts because they don't have a home to study in. Now, it is not arguable that human capital development is important to economic development. I know of nobody in any sphere that worries about poor countries that doesn't think it's really important to get people educated. This makes it harder, right? It just makes it harder for kids to learn, that they have to go find a lamppost to study under. If they had a place with a light bulb that they could come home to every day, probably easier to get educated, right? So there's this interaction between housing and education. And then health, this is becoming less and less controversial. Housing is important to good health, but dirt floors are just bad for health, and they're particularly bad for children's health. The dust worms, malaria, et cetera, a lot of this is alleviated when you have a non-permeable floor. You have a permanent floor that people could go home to. So again, no one would argue, I don't think, that sickness is inimical to the development process. Is when people aren't sick, you're going to do better. I mean, it's why we know water is so important, right? Is drinking water that doesn't make you sick is incredibly important to economic development. Well, not sleeping on a floor that's going to make you sick is probably some contribution to economic development as well. So I think there is a change in attitudes toward housing over the last, I'll say, 30 years. But I still think a lot of that attitude from the 50s, 60s, 70s remains. Okay. There's another issue, and we're going to have a panel about this, which I think is problematic for housing, is measurement. So measuring the productivity of a factory is easy, right? It makes so many sweaters, or so many T-shirts, or so many cars, or so much steel. Houses produce things too, it's just hard to measure. And we talk about this, the service flow of housing. We price it with something called the user cost of housing. And these things are invisible, but they're real. This is particularly problematic in societies where there isn't a lot of rental housing, because at least if you have an apartment, you could say, yeah, people are paying something for that shelter, so it must have some value to it. But when people own their own places, I mean, it's a good thing, and we see the capital amount they pay for it, but we don't observe that service flow. And I do know of countries, I'm not going to pick on them from here, maybe I'll pick on one or two later, that when they're looking at their GDP numbers, there's nothing about the service flow of housing in those numbers. Now here, the US, and I really try not to be a jingoistic American-esque around, I'm generally not, but when it comes to national income and product accounts, the US does a really, really good job of it by worldwide standards. And in there is this attempt, at least, to measure the service flow of housing, which probably makes up about 4 to 5% of GDP in the US when you total it all up. So that's a substantial number, probably about the same amount as new construction. And so as people are thinking about housing, because they're not measuring its full contribution, they don't see its importance in terms of the development of an economy. And so one of the things we might think about is how to get countries that are not measuring this at all to start measuring it. And if you want, I mean, Arthur and I did a paper along these lines 3 or 4 years ago in a Brazilian context to at least give a sense of how one might go about it. Lots of others have done this as well. Okay, so let's talk about where we are and maybe what we should do. So this is from, there's the wonderful World Bank website, Our World of Data, which I could get lost in for too long when I should be doing other things. But I found this is particularly striking, and this is, again, this is urban, but it's the share of urban population in slums. And the darker the color is, the more people live in slums. And so, again, socially, we think this is a bad thing. Economically, it may be a bad thing. This lack of, again, access to secure tenure, lack of access to well-hooked up infrastructure, and so on. So there's a little bit of good news, I think, was if you look at, so the left is, I believe, 1990, the right is 2018. And if you look at the left, I can't put, what's striking me, at least if we look at Brazil, things look like they've gotten a lot better over the course of the last roughly 30 years in terms of the share of people who live in slums. And so that's a positive development, but I'm going to just be a little cautious about that for reasons I'll share with you in a bit. But when we look at what's happened in Africa now, part of it is that in Africa, a lot of these countries weren't even measuring slum dwellers. But you can see there's been this rapid increase in the share of people who live in slums. And at the same time, as I'm sure you all know, Africa is, like the rest of the world, urbanizing. And so it's not just that the share of people has gotten bigger, it's that the number of people, the denominator, has gotten bigger. So this is clearly problematic. China, I mean, again, I think no one would argue with respect to housing that China has been an amazing success story, and it shows up there. One of the most striking numbers I know of is, and Steve Malpezzi taught me this some time ago, is at Shanghai in 1979, there was an average of 6 square meters per person in housing, and now it's about 20. So, I mean, that's quite remarkable in a short period of time. So, and by the way, China clearly has built a lot of housing and had reasonably strong economic development. Now, again, there's a reasonable argument that it's relied too much on housing for its economic development strategy. But the real takeaway I want from this is, while things have seemed to have gotten better in some places, clearly this is still a problem in wide swaths of the world. But I also want to come to this whole thing about urban-rural divide. And is it urbanization per se that we should be focusing on instead of housing? And this is a chart that I'm sure, a picture that I'm sure will be familiar to many of you. Again, it's from the World Bank. That just is a scatter plot of GDP per capita against urban population. And you know, that's as strong a positive correlation as you're ever going to see, right? And so this leads people naturally to the conclusion that urbanization produces productivity, produces growth. But let's, not so fast. So there's really a lack of direction about what causes, about the causal direction here. And we have some people, again, in this audience who've contributed to this literature. Vernon Henderson's book chapter from 2005. Some Buckley and Ney and Spence. I thought Bob Buckley was going to be here, so I wanted to flatter him, so I put that. Peng, Chen, and Cheng, Nguyen and Nguyen, et cetera. And I'm just going to give an example of how we really don't know what's going on here by taking, I just ran 3 very simple regressions in the last week, where I did a panel of urbanization against GDP for about, I don't know, I think 140 countries, what I have, 164 countries. And this is 1950 to 2016, I think. And again, the takeaway is I'm just looking at log urbanization against log GDP. I have country fixed effects. I have year dummies, and seeing what happens. And if you have no year dummies, so you basically don't have the trend, the common trend between the two. And again, I just freshened this up. A lot of people have done this before. Without that common trend, which is just you have urbanization going on over here and growth going on over here, it looks like urbanization is an incredibly important contributor to GDP growth, right? That's that 0.83, that's a big number, and it's very significant, okay? But all you have to do is add year dummies into this panel, and the sign reverses. It's actually, I wouldn't make a big deal out of the negative. I would say it's sort of barely significant, but Ed Glazer once said he doesn't believe anything with a t-statistic of less than 6, for what that's worth. But the point is, it's very sensitive to specification. So I don't think we really know, is it growth leads to urbanization or vice versa? And Vernon has written eloquently about this, is you have agrarian societies don't need that many people on farms anymore because they become more productive in agriculture, so they move to cities, and then you get agglomeration effects. But that's the productivity growth in non-rural areas leads to the cities, which has a feedback loop. I think we all believe that agglomeration is a real phenomenon, but nevertheless, urbanity isn't everything. And this is really important as we think about housing because, again, we tend to focus on urban services as well we should, but maybe we need to think about rural services as well, which is a challenge for obvious reasons. Okay. If we're going to do housing, one of the reasons I think housing doesn't have a great reputation is we have indeed, I don't think housing is per se a waste of money. Otherwise, I wouldn't be so thrilled to be having this conference. But it can be a waste of money. And so let's just talk about some debates about how to do housing and what is, should be done by the private sector or the public sector. I think most of us think, maybe not all of us, that the private sector actually is pretty good at delivering in an efficient way what people want and in the right places. But it is reasonable to point out there have been, so I am loath to say public housing works because I'm an economist and I'm an American, and with those two attitudes behind me, I have a predilection to not liking public housing. But there are two places in the world where it does work very well. Now one, the place on the right, Singapore, I don't know that it's really public housing. It's quasi, the government owns the land, but you can resell the housing, you can resell the condo that you own on the land with very little in the way of restriction. And so it is, and then you're on a ground lease, so the lease is 99 years, but it's sort of, there's a very strong public element to it, no doubt about it, but it's not sort of classic social housing as we think of it. But on the left, we have Vienna, which really is classic social housing. And I've been trying my mightiest to find somebody say something mean about Viennese public housing. And some of you in this room know I've sent you emails saying, do you know of anything that shows that Viennese housing is bad? And I got, maybe you were just ghosting me, but I got kind of silence in response. So they seem to have figured it out. Now, Vienna's very rich, Vienna's very small, maybe it's these unique circumstances, but to be fair, I think needed to talk about it. I mean, it's well located, people like it, it's well maintained, sort of all the stuff we don't think about when we think about public housing is there in Vienna. So maybe there are some lessons there. But nevertheless, here are a couple of places that I actually have some personal knowledge about. I've spent time in these places, Brazil and South Africa. Brazil has a program called Minha Casa Minha Vida, and it is been extremely successful in the following sense. They have built an awful lot of units. There's no question about it. They have delivered a lot of units and at reasonably low cost per unit. Okay. South Africa, again, the South African social housing program, same thing. They've delivered a lot of units, and this is, forgive the ego involved in presenting the picture on the right, but I'm in that picture. I visited this house in a township. It was about 20 kilometers from Pretoria. The house was lovely. I mean, it was well built. It had good services. It was probably, I don't know, 70 square meters, something like that. Perfectly acceptable house. But here's the but. Where they're located, I don't know how well this is showing up, but the left is Sao Paulo. The right is Johannesburg. The Johannesburg map probably shows up very well. The dark spots are where the public housing is, the social housing is. It's on the periphery, right? And similarly, if you look at Sao Paulo, if you could see the dots, which you probably cannot from your seats, but the dots are all on the periphery. Neither Gauteng nor Sao Paulo have good public transit, particularly at the peripheries. And some of these places are built where there is, it's not just that it's bad public transit, there is no public transit. And so what happens? Well, particularly, here is, if you go to D, that's where jobs are in Sao Paulo. Is the red is what's job rich. And so again, it's hard to see, but I've just put it up there. So if you look at sort of the dark in the middle of, that's where the jobs are in Sao Paulo. The houses are a long way away from the jobs. So we observe the following phenomenon in both Sao Paulo and actually in Gauteng in South Africa, is people are given these houses. They cost maybe $15,000 to build. The people who get them are very grateful, and then they sell them for $8,000 and move back to the slums in the middle of the city because they need to get to work, and they can't get to work from the public housing. Well, that's an indicator of waste, right? If you spend $15,000, if you put $15,000 of capital into something and it's resold at $8,000, that is $7,000 that's gone. And so as we're thinking about housing in its role, we need to think about doing it right. It's not just enough to say that we're going to do it. I'm also going to argue that having a robust rental sector is an important part of the puzzle, because not everybody wants to be stuck in a house. There are people who want to be footloose. There's this aspect of being able to have labor mobility is key. So, and even UN Habitat emphasizes its importance. Very often rental housing has better cash flow affordability than owner housing does. It allows households to reserve savings for other kinds of investments, like small businesses. It's an investment opportunity for the emerging middle class, particularly two-unit buildings. And again, it's this information benchmark. If you can observe rents, you can get a sense of, okay, what is the stuff really worth? And but landlords are really unpopular. Just ask if you ask a lot of people in the US, where does our housing problem come from? Which in my view is we just don't have enough of it. I mean, by world standards, we have plenty of it, but by US standards, we don't have enough units. Is people would rather blame landlords for the problem. Oh, these awful landlords, they keep raising rent. There are parts of the world where it is very difficult for landlords to enforce leases, which means people don't want to be landlords, because if you're not allowed to collect rent and there's no consequence for people not paying rent, you know what? People don't want to get into that business. So thinking about institutions that allow for a strong rental sector is also, I think, key to housing fulfilling its role in economic development. In situ or new development, I mean, this is a big debate. One of the really hard parts is you look in situ and you say, okay, this is where people should be, but the density of housing is not sufficient, and so you have overcrowding. And it's interesting, I'll never forget my first trip for a World Bank consulting job was to Dhaka, Bangladesh. And I had people tell me, well, high rises are evil, right? And density is evil, right? And I wanted to say, well, you have the density, you just don't have places for all these dense people to live. The people are there, but you need to build up. But the problem is that involves relocating people for a while and having governments be credible at short-term relocation that maintains social capital, so you're bringing people back where they were before. That's a very difficult thing to pull off. Now, I think arguably Hong Kong managed to pull this off in the 50s and early 60s, so it is a possibility, but it's very difficult. Okay, finally, I just want to note two countries that have had very different attitudes toward housing. The blue is Singapore. The red is South Korea, and the idea is not to make I should have done this in logs instead of constant dollars, but because then South Korea doesn't look quite so bad. South Korea has done great. Okay, the red line is not an inferior line. That's a really good line. It basically, if you go back to 1950, it was an extremely poor country. It's now a rich country. That's what that graph is trying to show. Singapore started out as a slightly richer place than, which basically versus Seoul. It's now gotten, by some standards, after Norway, it is the richest country in the world, richest, not counting tax havens like Monaco and Liechtenstein and such places. To me, if a country is smaller in population than Madison, Wisconsin, it shouldn't really count as a country for the purpose of economic comparisons. But both have done great. Very different housing strategies. So Korea, which I've been spending a lot of time reading about in the last couple of weeks because I'm trying to help on a chapter on Ukraine redevelopment, basically pursued the following strategy. It did basically nothing but human capital, maybe not by design, but in practice from the end of the Korean War to the early 1960s. Then they did industrialization and exports until about the 1990s, and then they started building housing. Singapore made housing part of what they were all about from the very beginning. And they used it as a mechanism to encourage people to save. They actually forced people to save. But then that savings had a channel which was to go into housing. And the Singaporean government saw housing both as key to political stability, but also to the economic well-being of the people in Singapore. And so this is the conundrum, right? I gave two examples of countries that have had remarkable economic success stories coming from very little, with very little in the way of natural resources that had completely different housing strategies, which means I have not been very helpful at setting the stage because I just said we still have a lot of questions that we need to answer. But then maybe that's what this is all about, to try to answer some of them.